So we all have a pretty good idea of what happens to the Railroad provided that they defeat both the Institute and the Brotherhood. However, what I've also wondered is what would happen to the Railroad as an organization if they were defeated in Fallout 4. Would they recover? Or would they disappear from the Commonwealth entirely, never to be heard from again? Today, I'd like to attempt to discuss what the future holds for the Railroad if either the Brotherhood, Minutemen, or Institute were able to defeat them in Fallout 4. But before we do that, let's discuss the various ways that the Railroad can meet their demise. So the Railroad story in Fallout 4 concludes in one of three ways provided what ending the player chooses. Of the four factions, the Minutemen and Railroad have the best relationship, and assuming that you're playing through Fallout 4 as a more morally upstanding individual, there's a really good chance that the Railroad won't become hostile towards you. And while the Minutemen may not be butt buddies with the Railroad, the Minutemen are certainly allied with the organization, and key Minutemen leadership like Preston do get upset if they witness Desdemona's death. Part of the reason that the Railroad doesn't become strongly allied with the Minutemen is because they feel that not everyone in the Minutemen is committed to the Railroad's goals, though I think Desdemona can explain it a little bit better than I can.
I just heard the most fascinating rumor. The story goes that you actually found the Institute. Been there and back again. Sounds crazy, right?
It's all true.
Deacon says you used teleportation. I can't imagine. You must feel justifiably proud of what your Minutemen have achieved in such a short time. Eventually, the Minutemen will devise their own plan to deal with the Institute. But I doubt your soldiers will place any priority on rescuing the synths inside. I'm counting on you being as passionate about freeing synths as we are. Please, work with us instead.
You think the Minutemen won't help the synths?
The Minutemen are a reflection of the character of the Commonwealth people. And time again, that character has been proven to be rotten. The synths are tangible receptacles of their hatred of the Institute. Order them to help, and they'd mutiny.
The defining moment, though, are the player's actions during the assault on the Institute. This is because the player can become an enemy of the Railroad if they don't trigger the evacuation signal. And if you go and talk to Desdemona after you destroyed the Institute and you didn't trigger that evacuation signal, here's what happens.
Hey.
You're the one who destroyed the Institute. You could have let the people on the inside live. Instead, you boxed them in and detonated your payload. You've killed an entire species, you monster.
So what? I killed some synths? They're machines, not people.
You unbelievable. What I do now is justice.
Shit, we got cover.
Live alive, everyone.
So as you can see, if you don't trigger the evacuation signal, the Railroad will become hostile and you will have to defeat the Railroad's leadership. Ultimately though, when it does come to the three endings where the Railroad meet their demise, the Minutemen don't necessarily have to kill the Railroad. When it comes to the Brotherhood ending, the Brotherhood send you to defeat the Railroad during the Tactical Thinking quest, and during this quest, the player is sent by Lancer Captain Kells to assassinate the Railroad's leadership. All of the key Railroad NPCs like Glory, Deacon, Tinker Tom, Carrington, and Desdemona will be killed during this quest. However, once the task is done, the player reports back to Kells and informs them that they're all dead. From there, the Brotherhood can focus on taking down the Institute, and once the Brotherhood does defeat the Institute, they become possibly the most powerful faction in the Commonwealth. And then there's the Institute ending. Much like the Brotherhood ending, Father sends the player to go kill the Railroad at the Old North Church hideouts. Basically, once the player deals with Desdemona and the rest of the Railroad's leadership at the Railroad's main HQ, the player returns to Father and then is tasked to go and destroy the Brotherhood of Steel during the Institute's Airship Down quest. Though once the Institute defeats the Railroad and Brotherhood, they essentially end up becoming the uncontested faction of the Commonwealth, especially when you consider that the sole survivor is the general of the Minutemen and ultimately becomes the leader of the Institute. But between all of the endings, the Railroad pretty much meet their end the same way. the player enters Railroad HQ, gets in a fight with the Railroad's leadership, and the Railroad are essentially no more. So to some degree, the Railroad's end in Fallout 4 at first appears to be relatively conclusive. Unlike the Brotherhood, there isn't a faction of soldiers back home to exact revenge for their lost comrades. Not to mention that the Railroad is mostly just a group of spies and not an organized military like either the Minutemen, Brotherhood, or Institute potentially are. However, I do suspect there would be survivors of the Railroad's destruction. In fact, if you check the Railroad's HQ terminal, you'll notice that it catalogs the fall of the Railroad several times under different leadership. So while Desdemona would be killed, provided the player has to fight the Railroad in the Railroad's own headquarters, I've got a feeling that someone would survive and the Railroad would regroup. In fact, I would go as far to say that this is guaranteed if it's the Institute that ends up wiping out the Railroad. Of the three endings, I think the Institute's victory over the Railroad may guarantee that the Railroad will eventually reform. After all, the main reason that the Railroad exists is because they want to help escaped synths. As we've seen in both Fallout 3 and 4, there's always going to be synths that become sentient and will have a desire to escape the Institute. And this is good for the Railroad in a sense, because even if the Railroad's leadership is wiped out, there will always be people that feel that synths should be saved from the Institute. And depending on the player's actions, relatively minor Railroad agents like Old Man Stockton, High Rise, and Mr. Timms could survive and eventually reform the Railroad somewhere else in the Commonwealth. And if those people could manage to get in contact with someone at the Institute to help send them synths like Desdemona did with Patriot, then it's likely that the Railroad would basically be back to the same capability that they had before. And if you're unsure about what I'm saying here, here's something that Father will say when the player asks if the Railroad is truly finished.
And so, the work is done. I am sorry. I know it was likely difficult for you.
You're confident the Railroad is finished?
As confident as we can be. It was always a loose network. But with the key players gone, it's not impossible that they'll be back someday. But it will take them time. There is obviously one final threat the Institute faces.
Either way, I think it's important to stress the fact that the Railroad exists as a sort of response to the Institute's own existence. So, if you ask me, if the Institute survives, then the Railroad will eventually reform and keep doing what they've always done. Now, in the other two endings, not only is the Railroad destroyed, but the Institute is also destroyed. In the case of the Minutemen, you don't activate the evacuation signal, and thus you enter conflict with the Railroad. However, with the Brotherhood, the Railroad is defeated, and afterwards, the player can decide to activate or not activate the evacuation signal while they're assaulting the Institute. And provided that the evacuation signal isn't activated, there's not much incentive for the Railroad to get back together. And as I've shown earlier on in this video, Desdemona made the claim that the sole survivor wiped out a species of beings, and if there are no new Gen 3 synths to be created or to help escape, then the remainder of the Railroad would have little purpose, and I think they would eventually dissolve. I would actually argue that from the Brotherhood's perspective, one of the worst things the sole survivor could do would be to turn the evacuation signal on and allow both the Institute's human and synth personnel escape. Not only would this give the Railroad some purpose and allow them to help free escaped synths, but I suspect the Brotherhood would have to allocate resources to hunt down, capture, and execute escaped synths. In a bizarre way, the Brotherhood might end up becoming kind of like the Institute's Synth Retention Bureau was, though instead of reclaiming the synths, the Brotherhood would end up massacring them en masse whenever they found them. What the Brotherhood can potentially do in the Far Harbor DLC would be a great example. They would send the equivalent of some kind of death squad to go and wipe out all of the synths. However, this could also be good for the Railroad. Instead of helping the synths escape from the Institute SRB, they're helping the synths escape from the Brotherhood at this point. And in a sense, it's a kind of a bizarre twist where the Brotherhood take the place of the Institute as the oppressors. But again, the outcome for the railroad rests on whether the sole survivor decides to activate the evacuation signal or not. If the signal is activated, the railroad might end up regrouping to help Synth escape the Brotherhood's death squads. If the signal isn't activated, in my mind, the railroad is done and the Brotherhood has less of a threat to deal with while they're establishing a base in the Commonwealth. This leaves us with the railroad's demise under the Minutemen, which should only occur provided the sole survivor goes and talks to Desdemona after the destruction of the Institute, and provided the player didn't activate the evacuation signal. Like I've stated before, there's not really much of a reason for the railroad to continue to exist provided that there are no synths to save, and I suspect that the railroad's end would come shortly after that. Perhaps there would be a couple of rebellions, but over time, the railroad's cause would get diluted, and new recruits would be hard to come by. After all, the railroad's original purpose of saving or helping synths would be lost. After that, it's kind of hard to say what happens next for the railroad. Perhaps the remaining railroad members would try to travel to Far Harbor, and I think between both the Brotherhood and the Minutemen are probably not going to try and hunt down every single synth like the Brotherhood would. Speaking of the Brotherhood, there's a possibility that the Brotherhood could still be around after the railroad's demise, though it's unclear whether the Brotherhood would want to try to go to war with the Minutemen at this point, especially since the Minutemen have access to artillery pieces that can put the Pridwen out of commission, and they just defeated the Institute without the need for Liberty Prime or power armor. Though I suppose if the Brotherhood is feeling cocky and they decide to fight the Minutemen, the ensuing battles could lead to the Brotherhood's demise in the Commonwealth, and with all three factions destroyed, the Minutemen would come out on top as the uncontested power in the Commonwealth. But to sum everything up, my thinking is that if the Institute defeats the railroad will eventually reform and try to attack the Institute again. As for the other factions, it's really contingent on whether the evacuation order is issued or not. Though if the evacuation order doesn't happen, I think the railroad is pretty much done. Either way, it's pretty fun to speculate what would happen to the Commonwealth if the railroad were defeated. But alright guys, I think that's going to wrap up this particular video. If you like this video, feel free to leave a like, click the bell to join the notification squad, and as always, take care, and I'll see y'all next time.